Hey everyone, Mike McClelland here to take an in-depth look at really how to break down the pre-spawn on a lot of different lakes across the country. I mean, we talk about doing one thing or another, you know, throwing a jerkbait, throwing a crankbait, throwing a pro swimmer. But when you come to really breaking it down, conditions, watercolor, so many different things come into play. So let's take an in-depth look of how I'm gonna break down the pre-spawn period. All right, so let's set the stage for what the pre-spawn period really is. I know a lot of people look at it differently. I mean, everybody's got their view on what pre-spawn really is. To me, living where I live and fishing the conditions that I fish, pre-spawn period to me is when you finally start getting those longer days, when the nights start getting a little bit warmer, when the water temperature finally quits dropping and actually starts climbing a little bit day by day. That to me is what puts these fish in that pre-spawn mode. That's what gets these fish moving out of their winter pattern into that staging area, into those places that they're gonna come first before they actually go to spawn. And there's a lot of different conditions that you can face throughout the course of these pre-spawn periods, and there's a lot of different ways that you can approach catching these fish. But three of my favorite baits to catch these fish on are a Spro rock crawler, whether it's the MD 55, the original 55, or the RK50. Those are the three rock crawlers. Then the Spro McStick, the 110, day in, day out, is probably gonna be my go-to. Every now and then you mix in a McRip, you mix in something else, but the McStick 110, day in, day out is the bait. And then you gotta throw in a Big Bite Pro Swimmer, either a 2.9 or a 3.3 Big Bite Pro Swimmer. Those are the baits that I love to attack the pre-spawn period with. And one of the biggest keys in the spring, when the water temperature does start rising, things start happening throughout the whole lake level. The bait typically starts rising in the water column. I mean, you quit seeing fish and bait down in the middle of the creek channels. You start seeing bait lift up and getting in the upper portion of the water column. So those are gonna be keys to me understanding that, okay, these fish are starting to make their move. The bait's coming off the bottom and the bass are gonna follow them. The big thing is understanding the migration routes that these fish are gonna take. You know, so much of the bait in the winter migrates into the creek channels, the deeper areas of whatever reservoir you're fishing. But as that water warms and they start lifting, they start coming up and then they start pushing. And the bait's gonna push, you know, sometimes they push to the back of pockets, sometimes they push to points. But the big key is they always typically use that creek channel to get to where they wanna be. So anytime you can put yourself close to the deepest contours, and again, that's why mapping becomes so important. I mean, the Garmin proprietary mapping is so important to me when I'm fishing pre-spawn, because I live and die by that mapping. I shade my depth zones so I know exactly where the creek channels are and where the deepest and shallowest points of water come together. And it's a really pretty simple breakdown when you really start doing it that way. I don't want to go into a big pocket and just take off fishing. I want to be very specific in the pre-spawn where I'm going to fish. I want to fish those creek channel bends, and then I want to move to where the creek channel intersects points. I want to move to where, you know, there may be some timber or something for the bait or the bass to suspend around, because a lot of times I believe these fish really want to just lift in the water column and start sunning themselves, getting themselves ready to go to the bank and spawn. For years and years, you know, we all know the golden rule. You want to fish the north side of the lake first. And the reason for that, it makes complete perfect sense. When you get those northern high winds in the spring, it's going to cool the water off. So the south side of the lake generally is going to be a lot colder. So yeah, I'm going to focus my attention pre-spawn first of all to the north area of the lake. The other thing that you need to take into consideration is the type of water you're fishing, the body of water you're fishing, whether it's a reservoir or a river, or, you know, just a flow-through lake. And when I talk about that, I mean White River chain of lakes, Beaver, Bull Shoals, Table Rock, they all have dams and tail races. Typically in the spring, the warmest water on our lakes is always going to be that water that's coming out of the dam. You know, water in Table Rock, the warmest water in Table Rock is gonna be the water coming out of Beaver Lake, because that water's coming out of the bottom of the lake. It's gonna maintain a, you know, upper 40 to low 50 degree temperature range. So when it's really, really early in the pre-spawn period, I'm gonna look at anything I can do to find the warmest water on the lake. You know, some kind of a place where water is discharged into the lake. Those things can all come into play, and those things can be huge factors in deciding where you're gonna break down and how you're gonna break down the lake. As I said earlier, I typically start in the bigger creeks on the lake. As the spring progresses, as the pre-spawn period progresses, I want to follow a movement of fish. You know, the fish that are living in creeks, those resident fish, they're going to go through the pre-spawn period quicker than the main lake fish. And my whole goal throughout the course of the pre-spawn period is to continue to chase it. So it's going to happen in the creeks first, and then it's going to migrate out toward the main lake. And eventually, you're going to be fishing for those main lake fish that hardly ever go into a creek. They migrate the same way. You know, they're gonna come off those creek channels. They're gonna come to points. They're gonna come to channel bends and transition areas. And that's the way I'm gonna break down a lake even further. Start in the creeks, move to the main lake, look for those warmer areas of water discharge, and you've got the pre-spawn period licked. All right, we've talked about a lot of different aspects of the pre-spawn period, but let's take an in-depth look at the actual baits that I'm gonna use to fish the pre-spawn period. The first of the baits that I'm gonna use, and we talked a little bit about them earlier, is the Big Bite Pro Swimmer and the Big Bite Finesse Swimmer. And when you look at these two baits, you might look at them initially and think, well, those baits are the same. Why do you want two different baits? And honestly, they've got two different purposes, and they rig different. I mean, the Finesse Swimmer is actually shaped a little bit more like a shad. It actually has a totally different action than the Pro Swimmer. They come in different sizes. The Finesse Swimmer comes in a 3.4 and a 4.4. The Pro Swimmer comes in, a multitude of sizes from a 2.8 all the way up to, a 5 something. So you've got different sizes for every application. The one key thing about the Finesse Swimmer in my mind is just the ease in rigging. It's got a hook slot in it, so it makes it a lot easier to rig. Sometimes, the solid swim baits can be a little tougher to rig. You don't get them rigged specifically. And the actual tail action, I mean, when you look at the two baits side by side, the Finesse Swimmer actually has a little tighter wiggle because the plastic's just a little softer and the tail's going to swim a little bit more freely. So that's the difference in the Finesse Swimmer and the Pro Swimmer. Multitude of colors. I mean, we've got everything from shad to brim to, to purples to lavender shad. I mean, we've got the gamut covered when it comes to colors. So it doesn't matter what the watercolor is, what the forage the fish are feeding on. The Pro Swimmer and the Finesse Swimmer are definitely the two swim baits I'm going to utilize pre-spawn. Now, when you start talking McSticks, I mean, the McStick 110, this is a bait day in and day out, like I said, that I am going to rely on for the pre-spawn period. The McStick 110 is a bait that I designed for Spro a number of years ago, and the characteristics of this bait is really, really key. One of the biggest things is the bait is built to suspend, and when you start talking about pre-spawn and you start talking about catching bass in that cold water, you want to make sure that bait's suspending. And I'm not going to tell you every single bait when it comes out of the package is going to suspend the day you throw it, because water temperature can affect and is going to affect how that bait's going to set in the water. So day in and day out, I'm going to adjust this bait. And the way I'm going to adjust it, the bait comes with number 5 Gamakatsu round bend hooks. If this bait may be a little too buoyant on a particular day that I'm fishing it, I'm going to upsize the hooks from a number 4 or a number 5 to a number 4, starting at the front, working my way to the back. I'm going to change out each hook if that's what it takes to get that bait to suspend due to the temperature of the water. But the McStick 110, again, I mean, you can see my box here. I mean, you talk about color variations. I mean, we've got the gamut colored. I think we've got 25 different color of McSticks available now. Then you start talking rock crawlers. I mean, you've got 3 potential options now. You've got the original RK55, you've got the 55 MD, and then you've got the RK50. So these 3 baits are going to be utilized in complete different manners. The original RK55, when I'm wanting to hit that depth range from 8 to 14 or 15 feet, the RK55, the original, is going to be the one I go with. When those fish start pushing up even shallower, then you've got the MD55 and the little RK50 to reach those 4 to 8 foot depths. You know, those places when the fish really push up a little bit shallower, and that's really what it's all about. Color-wise, I mean, we've got a huge color selection of RKs, and one of the other things that you really want to keep in mind is just those typical springtime colors. And I mean, one thing that I've definitely learned over the years is anything red, you know, is going to be a big, big hit in the spring. So, you know, colors like red craw, we've got the new Delta Craw. I mean, going to be a super new springtime color. The olive craw are all baits that I'm actually going to look to utilize even more in the spring. You know, you've got that bright orange bottom, but you've got a real neutral back. Springtime colors do make a difference, and reds definitely sell in the spring. All right, so now let's take an in-depth look at where to actually fish these baits. And I've talked about it a little bit before, but one of the biggest things and that really comes into play to me and where and why I'm going to fish these baits is going to be things that I learned by watching my electronics, whether it be standard 2D, side view, or live scope. All those things are going to factor in, but the biggest thing that I'm going to do is when I start fishing these creeks, I don't want to just go into any creek and start fishing. I want to go in, idle the creek, look at my Garmin electronics, and determine that there is forage in a creek. I mean, you're wasting your time if you go in a creek and you're not seeing bait, you're not seeing forage, you're not seeing bass on the screen. So the biggest thing is make sure you're fishing creeks that are active creeks. Once you do that, then you start looking to see where the bait's hovering. Is the bait in the middle of the creek channels? Is the bait leaning toward the points, the transition areas? And then you got to determine what level the bait's at, and that's going to determine why you're going to fish a particular bait. If all the fish that I'm seeing are bottom related and hugging tighter to the bottom, and the bait is hugging tighter to the bottom, which they will do a lot of times on cloudier days, those are the days that I'm probably going to throw baits like the Big Bite Finesse swimmer and the Big Bite Pro swimmer or the RKCrawler, because I want a bait that I can get down to the depth those fish are and actually fish through them. I love to lean toward transition areas where it's where a channel transitions to a point, if it's a rock transition on a bank, if it's a timber line. Transition areas, in my opinion, are some of the biggest keys to locating these fish in the spring. When you start talking about, well, why do you all of a sudden decide to go from a finesse swimmer or a RKCrawler to a jerkbait or a McStick? The biggest thing to me that makes that decision is where those fish are located in the water column. If I'm fishing and it's a bright, sunny, windy day, and I notice a lot of bait high in the water column from the surface down to 12 or 15 foot, that is when the McStick is going to be my go-to. And I can fish this McStick right up against the bank. I can fish this McStick out over treetops. I can basically fish this McStick anywhere I'm seeing bait on my live scope. So when you get into a situation where you get high winds, you get the shad being pushed to certain areas, that's going to be when the RKCrawler and the McStick really come into play for me. So when you get to the nuts and bolts of, you know, how I'm actually going to fish that RKCrawler, and again, you know, we talked about 3 different sizes. Basically, I'm going to fish these baits all pretty much in the same fashion, but with a lot of varied retrieves. You know, I talked about gear ratio reels. Early in the spring, you know, when the water temperatures are at their lowest point, I want to be throwing a 5-to-1 gear ratio reel. But a lot of times the key is you want to wind that bait down and get it to where it starts digging on the bottom. And rather than just, you know, a solid retrieve, a lot of times early in the spring, I'm going to stop and I'm actually going to sweep my rod. I'm not going to just totally just crank that bait. When I feel it hit a rock or something, I'll stop, sweep the rod a little bit, hesitate it, because those fish really aren't that aggressive in that cold water. You know, we fish temperatures in the low 40s, mid 40s, you know, lower 50s. So it's really doing different things with that crankbait. But you can feel when that bait, you know, first makes contact with the bottom, and so often you'll get a bite immediately. Whenever you do get the bait, you know, down there wedged in some rocks, I mean, every now and then it doesn't hurt to just shake it a little bit, and a lot of times fish will actually pick it up off of the rocks in that time of year. Another thing that I really want to key on this time of year, you know, pre-spawn, is, like I said, these drops. And I mean, you can see right here, forward-facing sonar and mapping both, how you've got this flat that comes out, but then it falls because of the creek channel turn right here. And that's where I'm going to focus a lot of my attention, is in these creek channels and where these creek channels transition off of the corners of these flats and points. And you know, I'm going to cover as much water as I can, but I mean, I'm going to utilize, like there's a good example of the bait fish. When you start seeing bait fish get high in the water column like that, I mean, that's when I really start thinking, okay, I need to be throwing a jerkbait. I need to be throwing a swim bait. I mean, there's fish actually suspended out there around those fish, and that's really something that you got to pay attention to in the pre-spawn period. It's one of those situations where you can fish a lot of fishy looking water, but if you're not seeing bait and if you're not seeing fish on your 2D sonar, forward facing sonar, you can be fishing a lot of voided water. And that's one of the big things that I think as an angler, as you mature and fish more and more of, you realize you can't just go back to those common places and spots that you've caught them through the years. You've really got to use your technology and really determine where the bait and where the fish are actually at. I mean, I've seen years where one creek can be hot as a firecracker on Table Rock, and the next pre-spawn, it's like there's no bait, there's no life, and you're wasting a lot of time fishing those areas. But this is another real key area right here. You can see where the channel bends real tight to this. So you've got a creek channel that swings up through here, and a lot of times these fish will position, you know, on the edge of this creek channel on the outside of these docks, and whether they're floating docks, pier docks, anytime I'm fishing pre-spawn, I'm always looking for these hard contour lines. When you zoom in here, I mean, you can see it breaks hard here. It goes from 20 foot to 5 foot in, you know, a 10 or 15 foot area. And those are the key places that I'm gonna be looking pre-spawn when I'm throwing a jerkbait, a rock crawler, and a swim bait. So probably one of the biggest things that has changed with jerkbait fishing, swim bait fishing, anything I'm doing pre-spawn, is the ability to actually use my Garmin live scope and look out in front of me and actually see where and how the fish are positioned. So it gives me an opportunity to really decide how I'm actually gonna present that bait to fish. You know, whether I'm throwing a jerkbait or a swim bait, I know now what depth range those fish are holding in. I know where the bait is. So, you know, if I look out there and I see that these fish are suspended, you know, 8 or 10 foot down, the whole thing with this McStick 110 is I want to throw it out there and I want to wind that bait down, you know, 7 or 8 turns to make sure I get that bait down to them. Once I get that bait down to them, I'm going to start working my bait with a different cadence, you know, whether it be pulls, twitches, but until you figure out what action and what, you know, retrieve it takes to get those fish to trigger, you've really just got to kind of, you know, work through it. The live scope gives you the ability to actually see how the fish are reacting to your bait. I know for a lot of years on Table Rock, you know, I felt like the slower you fish the bait, the better off you are. But as I've been able to watch these fish react to the bait on live scope, a lot of times you can move and twitch that bait really, really hard and then stop it and pause it and they'll get it. Or you can let it sit there for 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 seconds and they'll start easing toward the bait, and then you can snap it a couple times real hard and you'll get them to react. But that's the big keys that live scope has enabled us to do. I mean, like right now, I'm looking at a big ball of bait sitting just off the side of this bridge column, and when there's fish under that bait, I can actually see how I need to position the boat, how I need to throw the bait and get it into that bait ball itself. And I'm gonna vary my retrieves quite a bit. You know, I may start fast, and if I don't get any reaction from fish, I'm gonna slow down as the day or the hours progress. And you'll definitely even see times that these fish react different, you know, from early in the morning to late in the afternoon. So don't ever get hung up on one cadence or one retrieve through the course of the day. Another thing that, you know, is really important as well with the jerkbait is a slow gear ratio reel. I just think so often we just fish too fast in the spring. You know, we're fired up, we've been cooped up in the house and pre-spawn hits, and we all want to get out there and just go at it. And a lot of times you go out there with a 7-to-1, 8-to-1 gear ratio reel, and you're going to be fishing through fish that you should be catching. So basically when I pull up to one of these spots, you know, where you've got that deep water swinging up close to a point or a creek channel bending off of a bluff line or something like that, I'm looking on my live scope, I'm looking on my 2D trying to figure out, you know, where these fish are actually positioned. If the fish are positioned close to the bottom, I'm typically going to throw that swim bait out, and I'm actually going to let it just fall all the way to the bottom. I want to make sure that I get that bait to the bottom, and basically I'm going to do what we a lot of times just call scraping the bottom, scratching the bottom with it, and you can actually see my rod. I mean, I've got that bait on the bottom, and I just want to keep it scratching the bottom. Every now and then, you know, if you see a fish on live scope and they're lifted a little bit or something, you can pop it up a little bit, but I'll let that bait settle back down. You've got to remember, I mean, we're talking pre-spawn fish, we're talking cold temperatures, and a lot of days we're fishing, you know, in extremely cold temperatures, you know, 30s, and generally when I'm fishing in the really cold months of the year, I want to use a Sunline Sniper. It's just a little softer, a little more subtle, works a little better on those cold days, and as the days warm and the water temperature comes up, I really like to go to shooter. Just the sensitivity level's so much better. If I start noticing the fish lifting up off the bottom when the sun shines, the bait gets up higher in the water column, I'm going to throw that swim bait out and actually count it down, you know, to the depth that I feel like the fish and the bait are holding at, and I'm just going to wind that swim bait at a slow, steady pace through the fish, over the fish, until I determine, you know, what it takes to actually get one to bite. I mean, a lot of days if I'm fishing suspended fish in timber or treetops, I want to throw that swim bait, let it fall where it's 3, 4, 5 feet over the top of the timber, and just wind it at a slow, steady pace over the top of the timber, and you'll draw fish up out of that timber that'll come up and get that swim bait. It's just incredible what we have, the ability we have now with live scope, being able to actually see the fish, see how they're positioned, and being able to target each of those individual fish. I mean, the biggest thing about, you know, when I'm throwing the pro swimmer, the finesse swimmer, is just simply, you know, trying to decide which head is going to work best. I mean, there's definitely days when an underspin is going to outfish a standard head just due to the fact of the conditions of the day. You know, we talked about that quite a bit, and the conditions really probably dictate when I'm going to throw an underspin more. If I've got a little bit more color in the water, or if I've got situations where I've been fishing sunny days and get to that point where you know, the cloud cover rolls in, a lot of times that underspin can really make a difference. This little Gamakatsu new underspin mini, it's you know, sets up perfect. The big bite swimmer head and the Tru-X big bite swimmer head are both my top choices, but there are those days that the underspin can really be a big deal. Another big question I get asked is, you know, what rod, reel, line, and equipment do you use for each of these applications? When it comes to the big bite finesse swimmer, the pro swimmer, and a couple of these rods actually will cross over to do other things with, there's really 2 or 3 rods, and I say that pretty openly. There's 2 or 3 different rods that I like to throw. First of all, I mean, I generally am always going to throw a 7-foot to 7.3 medium to medium heavy action rod when I'm throwing a pro swimmer or a finesse swimmer. When the fish are really finessey, when they're really lethargic and they're not getting the bait good, I typically like a rod that's a 7-foot 4-power, medium action, something that's got a really soft, fast tip. The rod's even a little bit parabolic, so when those fish aren't aggressive and they're not getting the bait good, they can actually take the bait without you taking it away from them. And the rod I specifically like to use is a Falcon Expert, the Falcon Lowrider, the Falcon Buku, and also the Falcon Cara in the 417 are a great rod for those finessier type applications. Those days that you're needing to use, you know, 8 or 10 pound Sunline shooter fluorocarbon. When you're throwing it on a 5-to-1 gear ratio reel, you really need to slow down. That's when I want to use the 417. As those fish get a little bit more aggressive, or maybe I've increased the size of the head that I'm using to throw, then I'm going to go to either the 5172 in the Expert series, or I'm going to go to the 5172 in the Cara series. These are both rods that a little bit longer, 7-foot 2-inch rod, but you know, anything from that 7 to 7.2, 7.3 and a medium to medium heavy action is going to work, but my choice is definitely going to be, you know, the Expert or the Cara when it comes to this application. The sensitivity is just better. You can feel the soft bites, and it definitely works. There's going to be days that I'll increase line size on these. I mean, I might go up to 14 or 16 pound Sunline shooter or Sunline Sniper, depending on, you know, the type of condition that I'm fishing on those particular days. When it comes to the actual swim bait heads, I mean, in my opinion, you know, anytime I'm fishing open water, table rock, you know, bull shoals, in any open water situation, there's basically 2 heads I'm going to use, and I'm going to use these in probably sizes ranging from 3/16 ounce up to 3/8 ounce. And that is the Big Bite Tru-X swimmer head and just the original Big Bite swimmer head in those 3 different sizes. The key to this bait is the light wire Gamakatsu hook. I mean, you don't want to have a big firm hook set when you're catching fish on a swim bait. You just want to wind into them, and that light wire Gamakatsu hook that these swimmer heads come in are perfect for those applications. Moving on to the jerkbait. You know, a lot of people like anywhere from about a 6'6" to a 7-foot rod when it comes to throwing a jerkbait. The action is pretty well the same as what we just talked about. A 4-power, a rod that's got a super good soft tip, something that loads up good, so when those fish eat that treble hook jerkbait, they can get the bait before you react too quick and take it away from them. Typically early in the spring, I'm gonna throw a 5-to-1 gear ratio reel, but when I'm throwing my jerkbait, my line is going to change. I'm gonna throw 2 different lines when I'm throwing a jerkbait. I'm either gonna throw Sunline FC crank, or I'm gonna throw Sunline Supernatural, and that's gonna range from 8 to probably 14-pound test early in the pre-spawn period. And the difference in the line size is all gonna be a matter of how deep I want the bait to go. The deeper I want my McStick to go, the smaller line diameter, the smaller size I'm gonna throw. But I do not wanna throw a McStick on straight fluorocarbon, such as shooter or sniper. I wanna throw it on Supernatural or Sunline FC crank, because that line is less, it's less dense in the water. It basically will allow this bait to hover in the water column, and that to me is the key. I mean, as I said earlier, you want this bait to suspend, and if you're dragging it down with a straight fluorocarbon line, you're not accomplishing what you want to accomplish. Then when it comes to you know, that specific rod, I mean, my Falcon 6/8 jerkbait rod is going to be one that I lean on, and there are occasions where I'll go to the Falcon 417 as well for the jerkbait, because when I want to make those longer open water casts, I feel a little more comfortable with the 7-footer. But if I'm fishing around boat docks, around timber, around tight targeted areas, I definitely prefer the 6/6 to the 6/8 Falcon for those applications. So when it comes to the rock crawler, I mean, across the board, day in, day out, I mean, I'm never going to veer from a 7-foot, generally a medium action rod. And my personal opinion and my feeling about this, I mean, when you look at that rod and the bend it has, I can't take that bait away from fish. I mean, if they're eating it all and I'm winding that bait through them and they get it, that rod is gonna do the work for me. So I want a medium action 7-footer. And Falcon builds, in my opinion, across the board, because sensitivity isn't as big a key. So from the Falcon Buku 417 all the way through to the Cara 417, that rod is gonna get it done. The other thing about the rock crawler, when you start talking about, you know, the specifics, line, it's always gonna be Sunline FC crank, and it's gonna vary, like I said, from 8 to 16-pound test, all depending on how deep I want that bait to go. That is day in, day out the key. There are times if I'm fishing, you know, lakes that I'm catching bigger ones in, that I want to throw the heaviest line that I can get away with and still accomplish the depth. But day in and day out, it's going to be 10, 12, 14-pound tests, Sunline FC crank. Another thing about the rock crawler is you got to remember to change the hooks out according to, you know, how you want that bait to set in the water, or how fast you want it to rise and fall. If I want this bait to be a little less buoyant, I'm going to change the number 5 standard Gamakatsu out with the number 4, sometimes on the front and the back, to slow down the rise of that bait in those cold water situations. So that's a pretty in-depth look at the equipment that I use to throw the baits I throw in the pre-spawn period. All right, so here is your nugget of the day. You've heard me mention it 2 or 3 times throughout the course of this pre-spawn in-depth look at what I'm gonna do to break down and the baits I'm gonna use. But one of the biggest keys, in my opinion, to being successful in the springtime is making sure you've got the right hooks on those rock crawlers and McSticks. You've heard me mention upsizing hooks. I always like the just the standard round bend. When I want to upsize, I'm very seldom ever going to go above a number 4 round bend. But another little nugget I want to throw you is every now and then it doesn't hurt to throw in a little Gamakatsu red hook. If you get those days when fish are grabbing the tail hook of a bait and you want them to eat the bait head first, throw your red Gamakatsu on the front hook of that bait and it'll help those fish zero in on the bait when you get there. One thing about it, these round bend, sticky, sharp Gamakatsu hooks are going to allow you to catch those fish that are just slapping at a bait way more effectively than a lot of other hooks on the market. So now that we've taken an in-depth look at the pre-spawn period of the year, take these tips that I've given you today. You're going to have a lot more success on the water. Check out all the products below and go out and catch them.